If I could call everyone to order. Wow. I'm back in Nebraska. I forget how sort of like receptive and responsive and polite everybody is in the Midwest. Hi, my name's Dr. Lorna Bracewell, and I had the privilege for 2.5 years of being a faculty member in the political science department here at UNK. I'm now a member of the political science faculty at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida, which is my home, so I'm very happy to be back closer to home. But I also miss my second home here, and it's wonderful to be back. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Heath Fogg Davis. Dr. Heath Fogg Davis is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at Temple University. I could dazzle you with a litany of his scholarly accomplishments. His CV is formidable, I assure you. But what is truly impressive about Dr. Fogg Davis is that he is no mere academician. As I put it in a review I had the privilege of writing of his most recent book, Beyond Trans, Does Gender Matter? Fogg Davis brings complex contemporary theories of sex, gender, and race down from their rarefied postmodern heights to offer practical guidance to institutions and organizations on how to alleviate discrimination and bolster equality and inclusivity. In other words, Fogg Davis is a rare combination of intellectual and activist who can explain Judith Butler's theories of gender performativity to the head of HR at your organization. As Fogg Davis describes himself, all of my teaching, scholarship, and activism seeks institutional changes that can empower communities, alleviate structural violence, and build a more sustainable and just future. I can't imagine a scholar better suited to serve as the keynote speaker for UNK's first ever LGBTQ Research and Community Symposium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Heath Fogg Davis.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Lorna, for that introduction and also for your friendship and being such a great colleague. And I also want to thank Patrick for the Herculean task of organizing an event like this. This conference is truly groundbreaking and amazing, and I'm thankful to all of you for being here. I also want to say I just sat through an amazing student panel prior to this that just about made me cry, but for good reasons, not bad reasons, just because UNK students and also students who are here from Flagler College in Florida had used what I'm going to talk about today, this gender audit, to take a look at their own institutions and figure out the places where gender and or sex was mentioned in a policy. And they're doing amazing stuff, and they've already done amazing stuff. They're bringing about precisely the kind of administrative changes that I think that we need, and just to kind of reinforce your efforts to say that when those messages come from students, the administration will listen to you eventually, so keep at it. Okay, so I commend them tremendously. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the book itself, some of the main arguments in it, but I'm also going to bring it, like Lorna said, just sort of make it plain, to talk about some concrete examples of what I think a better, more trans-inclusive world would look like. And so I will do that. I want to leave a lot of time at the end for conversation, so be thinking about questions or comments, and I want to hear from you as well. And also, I will just say that I will come out in another way also today, which is to say that I grew up in a farming community, and it's been a long time since I've lived in a rural environment, and so coming to Nebraska, it was both sort of like a bit of a culture shock at first to land at the airport, which is amazing. It's super small, but it was amazing, and the never-ending cornfields was a familiar sight to me. And on a serious note, just to say that, I grew up in a time when I very much felt like that was not a place that I could stay for the rest of my life and grow up. And it does make me a little emotional to see that is happening and that those changes are being made. And so I just want to thank you all for that. Okay, all right, here to my talk. So I just mentioned farming communities and cornfields and rural environments. So let's go from that to sort of the opposite, and I'm going to plop you down in Center City, Philadelphia, which is where I've made my home for the last 13 years. So this is a city bus going around City Hall. So Philadelphia is a huge city, as you know, making its way. So you might be wondering at this point, why are we looking at a bus when we're supposed to be talking about gender identity and trans inclusion? So this is the reason why we're talking about it. Because Philadelphia had a policy for a number of years, from 1981 all the way up to 2013, of gender marking its bus passes. So this meant that if you wanted to get a monthly pass within the city of Philadelphia, you had to get an M or an F sticker attached to your bus pass. It sounds ludicrous, and I think eventually the city got rid of this, but let's talk about why they were there in the first place and how they came to be removed. All right, so this person is Charlene Arcilla, who passed away, but she was an eminent force within the city of Philadelphia, an African-American trans woman who was an activist and led on a lot of different fronts in the community. She bought a pass, and I should say that there was a distinction also that had to do with race and class, and so like a lot of cities, people who live within Philadelphia tends to be majority black city, and then the suburbs are mostly white. People who were taking regional rail and using those train lines did not have to get a gender marked pass, but those within the city did. So there were discrepancies there as well. All right, so Charlene, and here's a picture of her. A lot of local news started to follow her story. So she bought the pass that made sense for her. I mean, she identified as female, so she bought an F marked pass. And she tried to use it. And it wasn't every time, but sometimes she got hassled, and there were even times when they told her, you can't take the bus at all. So this kind of like discretionary leeway where she never knew when exactly that she would be turned away, but it was always a possibility, was incredibly discriminatory and oppressive, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. So because she was an activist, she decided to test the system. So let's see if I buy an M marked pass, what happens? And she did that, and she was turned away as well. Right. So this created a scenario. She was told that you're not a real man. You're not a man, and you're not a real woman. So this goes to the essence of the argument that I want to make, that it's often bureaucrats and people who are working. Imagine being a bus driver operating a bus in the city of Philadelphia. You have so much to take care of, and just physically driving the bus itself. Each bus driver was supposed to check each pass that came before them for the correct date and also the correct gender marker. So the employee handbook actually said this. A lot of them did not have time to do this, so it was an inconsistent kind of policy. But there were cases where if a bus driver wanted to, they could hassle somebody who was gender nonconforming or appeared to be trans. And I want to emphasize that a lot of these trans discriminatory policies impact people who are visibly trans, or people assume that they're trans. And that's an important kind of distinction, regardless of how the person self-identifies. Okay. So because she couldn't use either pass consistently, she was literally left out in the cold. She could not consistently access the public accommodation that she had paid for. So in Philadelphia, a lot of grassroots activism started to sprout up around this particular case. So what happened was that Charlene, she filed a legal complaint with the City of Philadelphia's Human Relations Committee, and this is the office in the city that is charged with enforcing their anti-discrimination ordinances. So Philadelphia has a lot of protections, including gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, and the list is very lengthy. things are very different once you step outside of Philadelphia into some of the rural parts of Pennsylvania. So we talked about that at the beginning. That's important to note. So her case sort of went on for a long time. SEPTA dragged its heels or its wheels, to make a bad joke there. And this group, Philly Rage, which has one of my most favorite acronyms. So RAGE stands for Riders Against Gender Exclusion. And this was an amazing grassroots organization effort that just kept at it. And they did a number of things. They penned a Writers' Bill of Rights, and they went to SEPTA's offices and, did sit-ins there and had all sorts of protests that happened throughout the city. Here's a picture. I'm sorry it's not clearer, but here's a picture of one of their protests that happened underneath City Hall. So you saw the bus at the beginning going around City Hall. Here's one of the most the busiest subway stations in the city, and they did a number of these. And so some of the signs say instead of a F or an M, how about a P for passenger, and other signs as well. So they persisted in their efforts, and eventually they were successful. So in 2013, SEPTA dropped its gender markers from its passes, so we no longer have that. And I think it's important, like when I did the research on this, I discovered that a lot of American cities had this practice at one point, but Philadelphia was unique in persisting as long as it did. Can anybody think of, every kind of like business policy has to have some kind of like rational relationship to some legitimate business goal? So thinking about SEPTA, which is a partially private and partially public entity, what possibly could be a business justification for having a gender marker on a bus pass? If you had to be SEPTA's lawyer and make the case. Yeah. Right. Keeping riders from sharing passes, or in the business speak of it all, to say fraud prevention. Yeah. And that, I think we can agree, is like a legitimate business goal for, most entities. Do you think that this was a good means of preventing fraud? Yeah. It falls apart pretty quickly, because if you're trying to prevent people from sharing passes, you can just say, if I have an M marked pass, I can find somebody who appears to be an M, and I can share the pass with them, and it goes on and on, right? So it wasn't a legitimate kind of policy. There were other ways to get to that end. What are some of the other ways that you could prevent fraud, that SEPTA could have prevented fraud? Any thoughts about that? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So a photograph maybe, and then there's always the issue of like, people do change their, hairstyles and hair colors. Like there are mutable characteristics, but you could require people to have an up-to-date photo. So that would be a good way. Any other ideas about how you could do this? Yes. Yeah. And in fact, that's where they moved, and so they were really was antiquated in a lot of ways with their technology, and so moving to that kind of a system as well. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to spend too much time in kind of like the real sort of like education, this is all about education, but the sort of the didactic part of it here. I think that there's sex discrimination going on here, but it's not the kind of sex discrimination that we're used to thinking about. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so that's what I want to talk to you about. So the traditional way that we think about sex discrimination is sex-based disadvantage. And this is the traditional case of sexism where women as a class or group are treated, are put at a disadvantage in relationship to men as a group or a class. And this has been the traditional format. Courts have used this format. Even liberal feminist judges have ended up upholding a lot of sex segregation and sex policies based on this idea that nobody is harmed. And so in the case of Charlene, somebody was harmed. And so it made me think about this question about, why do we have sex markers on our driver's licenses, on our passports, on our birth certificates? What about sex-segregated bathrooms or sex-segregated sports? Students talked about this earlier today. All sorts of examples. Are they necessary, or are they just forms of tradition that we're holding on to just because? Okay, so Charlene argued that her situation constituted gender identity discrimination, and that is a protected category in Philadelphia. It's not at the federal level, and a lot of states don't have this protection as well. I think a better term for gender identity discrimination is sex identity discrimination. And what I mean by this is the kind of discrimination where somebody corrects you or tells you that you're not right about your self-statement about where you belong in the sex binary. So I am all about self-determination where gender is concerned. I think it's important, and when you have policies like the one that SEPTA had, you put other people in the position of overriding your self-statement. So this is who I am, Charlene, this is my gender identity, I bought a pass, I paid for it, she should be able to use that. It's nobody's business, and they shouldn't legally be able to override that decision. Okay, so there are two liberal strategies that I want to argue against, and we'll get to the one that I think is the best option. The first one is assimilation. So this is the strategy that allows somebody like myself, who is a pretty binary identified trans man. I don't get hassled in public restrooms when I use a men's. Nobody looks at me. When I was a masculine presenting woman, and I transitioned about 2008, that's going on about 15 years now, I was hassled all the time, and so I want to make that clear as well. So a lot of trans people have a history that isn't exactly apparent just by encountering us now. So this is the policy that lets you change your sex marker on your driver's license. We can do this in Pennsylvania from M to F or F to M. Right? So that's the assimilate into the existing sex binary. Accommodation is the other liberal strategy, and these two have been the most popular in trans civil rights advocacy. And I want to be clear, I'm not knocking these, that they haven't been important, but I think that they don't go far enough, and I want to push things a little farther, and I think that we can. So the other strategy would be accommodation. This is where you add a third option. So in the case of driver's licenses, this is the addition of an X in addition to F and M, so that there are 10 states in the District of Columbia now allow this option. So you can request to have an X instead of an F or an M on your driver's license. And here is the first person to apply for such a license in DC. There are also, I mentioned at the beginning that I grew up in a farming community. I don't know if I said it was in Ontario, Canada, but it was. And so, interestingly enough, my country has been very busy at bringing about a lot of these reforms, much more so than this country that I have come to. So it's been an interesting kind of thing to witness that happening. Not to say that there aren't problems or there isn't resistance in Canada, but they've been a lot more progressive when it comes to trans inclusion. Here is somebody holding a birth certificate that's been amended. So in Ontario, the province of Ontario, you can amend your birth certificate to have an X designation instead of the M or the F. Okay, so this again is an accommodation. It's also the case when you have the third gender-neutral bathroom in addition to the existing sex-segregated bathrooms. That's an accommodation, and that's traditionally like predicated on the ADA model of a disability bathroom that's accessible. And now we're kind of multi-purposing that bathroom, which is a lot to put on that one single stall bathroom that is now supposed to serve everybody who doesn't want to or can't fit into the sex binary as the bathrooms are organized. Okay. The place that I would like for us to go is something I call gender inclusive policy design. And this really is answering the question, do we need the sex marker in the first place? And I think in a lot of cases we don't. And interestingly enough, and you might be surprised to hear this, of all places, Medicare, the federal government agency here, has decided to eliminate the gender markers from its member cards, and they did this last April. And I want to give a shout out to the National Center for Transgender Equality, which is a DC-based organization, and they were instrumental in bringing about this change. It's huge, and it's really interesting that this happened given the political climate in Washington right now. It goes to show you that there are a lot of like nodes of power administratively, like you can make a lot of changes happen just by figuring out, tracing the lines of power. So getting rid of those, I think, is a really important thing. In my work and when I work with organizations, I do some consulting with companies and organizations. I have them do a gender audit, which is exactly what the students did, which was amazing to hear the results of it. And it kind of goes like this. We're just taking a look. When and where is the word sex or gender used in a policy? And it's important to also think about whether these two terms are synonymous. In academia, we spent a lot of effort, and Judith Butler included, to be very precise in our definitions. When it comes to courts and a lot of our everyday usage, we use these terms back and forth, and we're not very careful about what we mean by them. So I want people to be careful about what they mean and actually define the terms. So abolish the sex classification policy if it isn't necessary. So figuring out, do you actually need the policy in the first place? And I thought a very interesting example from the student panel before this session had to do with the student who was in a choir and the required professional dress for the people in the choir, and or I should say symphony, I guess, because they were using instruments. You can tell I'm not a music person. Anyway, they were playing music, and there was sort of like a sex-specific code of dress that women had the option of like a black skirt, and men had an option of the black tuxedo or wearing black. And the student was saying, why not just not specify the particular items, but just say that black formal attire, and for students who have to hold the instrument between their legs, having a skirt on is not a practical thing. And I just love that example, but because it's a good example of where you don't have to mention gender at all. You can get to your legitimate policy goal of having everybody dressed in black and looking uniform in a symphony without specifying the clothing by gender. Sometimes it is important or legitimate, I think, to mention gender or sex in a policy. And when we do that, I think we have to be specific about the definition that we're using. I have a couple of things in mind where I think that sex actually matters. Can anybody think of an example, where you think that, yeah, we might want to take sex or gender into consideration somehow, like it might be a good reason for having it in a policy? Any thoughts about that? Yes. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that briefly. Yeah, because I think a lot of people probably might come up with that example too. Is sex, like, let's talk about like an intake form. You go in to see a doctor or like to the ER, we get paperwork to fill out. Should that paperwork include, like, ask you about your gender? I guess, like, let's ask this question. What might the legitimate reason be? Medications. Yeah. Okay, good. Anything else? Medical testing. Yeah. Right. Sex specific. A pap smear, a prostate exam, things like this. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. It does. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes, please. Yeah, complicating the formula, but any other thoughts? Okay, these are great comments, and they go to the point that I would make, which is, yes, the ultimate legitimate health goal here is for a doctor to provide good individual health, access or treatment to a particular person. That's different from statistical, medical science, which is another thing, and we can talk about that. But when you're talking about like an individual healthcare provider encountering a new patient, it's important. If I'm a doctor, I want to know about specific procedures and tests that have to do with specific body parts. And I think we use sex markers in the medical field as a proxy for what your body looks like. And in a lot of cases, I would argue the majority of cases, you're going to be right, but sometimes you're going to be wrong. And when you're talking about individual healthcare provision, that's a really problematic thing because it is about the individual. So it can be an impediment for a healthcare provider actually knowing about your body and how to provide good healthcare. So I would just we can talk about that a little bit later if you like, but a lot of times we're using sex markers as a proxy for some other kind of information, and I feel like just ask directly about the information if that's what you want to get. Okay, so let's talk about the educational settings. Here at UNK, do you all use the Common Application for students who remember applying to school here? You use the Common App? Yeah. Okay, so you may or may not have realized that the Common Application, that you can't get past this screen without checking a sex box. So here we have an online form that does not allow you to move on to the next one. So in the course of writing the book, it was really interesting. I would go back and check, and the Common Application form would change every couple of months where the gender markers are concerned, the questions that they asked. And this is an indication that we're in flux as a society right now. Like, do we add another transgender option? What does that tell us? Do we have an open box and let people tell us their own gender identity? How do we operate here? So they're kind of in limbo at the moment. They have both assimilation going on here and accommodation. You can see here the assimilation part is to check, male or female, but also there's an open text box here. It says, if you would like the opportunity to, we invite you to share more about your gender identity below. So there's an open text box there. The problem with this, as you probably are thinking, is it's not clear how that data is compiled and what gets done with it. So if I'm filling this form out and it's important for my future college to know something about my gender identity, this might just be a throwaway box of data that that's not taking into account. Plus, there's no definition given here of sex or gender, whether we're talking about the sex that's designated on a legal document versus how you identify yourself, all these things. So that's something to think about as well. I want to talk a little bit about sex-segregated organizations on campuses, since we're on one right now, and then we'll segue into more of a conversation with you. But I show you a picture here. What is this a picture of? A little test if you're still awake. Are you with me? For easy credit. What is this a picture of? Right. It's a fraternity, and in part you can see by the red cups here that it is something to do with that. So this is actually a picture of a fraternity at Yale University, and I worked with a student organization there that is called Engender, and one of their main missions was to get the fraternities on campus to open up their rush processes to people of any gender. So tackling this issue of sex segregation in fraternities. Sororities, they weren't exactly sure about, and so we can talk about that. There is an asymmetry, we all know, of power in our society, so what fraternities stand for versus sororities may have different resonance. There are all sorts of reasons why we might want to rethink fraternities. Anybody have ideas? What might be problematic from like a position of like sex equity or some of the issues that we're talking about here, or even the themes of this conference. Anything? No. Everybody's both fraternities as they already are. So, I mean, basically, we know that there are disparities that have to do with your professional networking. So fraternities also intensify in-group bias and out-group animosity. So stereotypes about women are increased in some of these all-male environments. We also know that sexual assault and sexual harassment are things that are exacerbated often in these environments. So it's not to say that all fraternity members do these things, but the institution itself, I think, should be questioned. Okay, so let's move on. This is my final example. We're also, can anybody identify there is a former president in this picture? It's the first President Bush, right? And Barbara Bush. And here is a picture of a student organization, sex-segregated organization. It's an a cappella group that has the very precious name of the Whiffenpoofs. Maybe only an Ivy League school could kind of, but has a long tradition of being an all-male a cappella group. And here they have the great privilege of performing for a former president. Here is their counterpart at Yale, which is called the Women Rhythms. And here, this is the all-women's a cappella singing group. It has a tradition also, but not as long of a tradition as the male one, in part because Yale used to be an all-male school, but there are other reasons as well. They have not been invited to perform for former presidents, and there are a lot of other privileges that they don't get to have. The Whiffenpoofs get a year off from their studies, all paid to travel around the world and tour with this because it's, it has this audience that it's built up over time, and several other privileges as well. So there's a disparity here that often exists. Anytime that you have sex-segregated facilities, there's often a disparity between them. They're never exactly equal. Think about the bathroom situation. As I said, I transitioned, like 13 years ago, so I was also, I know about the long lines for women's bathrooms, and that's a disparity. You can sort of, make it, it's trivial, but it's not. Particularly if you're at like a concert or a venue where it's very crowded, there are all sorts of disparities along gender lines. Okay, so here are the Whiffenpoofs again. Anybody know where they are now? they're getting around, they're doing fun stuff, interesting stuff. This might be a little dated reference here, but this is cast of a particular TV show that Glee. Yes. They are on the set of Glee. So they had that honor and that experience. The Women Rhythms did not have this experience. So it just goes again to the point about even when we have sex-segregated facilities or organizations that we think are not harmful along trans inclusionary lines, they're often just replicating traditional forms of sexism as well. So there are a lot of reasons to get rid of a lot of the sex segregation that we have in our society. All right, the takeaway, and then I'll open it up to you and invite your questions and comments. So sex classification policies always trigger sex identity discrimination. The question is, is it sometimes justified? And the one instance I think it's justified would be in sex-based affirmative action, where you're actually trying to pay attention to gender balance in a particular college environment or workplace environment. I think that those, or remedial forms of sex-based affirmative action can make sense. But I think that we should minimize and redesign wherever possible. And also this point that I really want to underscore, which is that gender-inclusive policy design helps trans people, but also non-trans people. So there are a lot of universal benefits that come from radically rethinking how we structure our public restrooms, for example, and things like that. So that is what I have to say. I thank you for your attention. I know it's a little warm in here, and I invite your questions and comments. Excellent. Yes. Questions, comments, stories?
That's all right. Just make sure everybody.
Okay, so when you were talking about like the fraternities, this is like just my personal opinion, so I don't really know what it's like at other colleges, but I feel like we're really inclusive of cisgenders. What ways do you think like we can be progressive about including all genders, as we've like kind of learned to accept all sexualities?
Okay, I think when you're talking about sort of like there's the one issue of like getting rid of the sex classification policy, but also yes, you can. Sorry about that. So just so I understand your question, are you asking about what proactive measures we could do to make people of all genders feel included? Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think it's, like my argument and my work is sort of operating at one level, but I think a lot of additional work has to happen, and it's precisely what you're talking about. So actually, I mean, some of this can just be done in terms of like a mission statement. I mean, that's important as a starting point to say, here's what we're about. We are about including, and sometimes enumerating and saying not just that we're gender inclusive, but that we are welcoming of people who identify as trans, gender fluid, gender non-binary. So it's like specifying, I think, can also be a signal to people that you're serious about what you're doing and that you've thought about it. So I think that those measures are really important. And then there's the larger kind of like deeper institutional education that has to happen. So it's one thing to take away some of these policies, but then I do think that we have to have conversations about, like what, even just about trans identities and what that spectrum entails, and educating people about terminology and things like that. So thanks. You're making Dr. Bracewell get her exercise by
Get my stuff
sprinting back and forth.
When you're working with corporations, what kind of resistance do you face, and what's the weirdest kind of resistance you faced?
Weird resistance. That would be a good title of a book or something. I'd have to give that some thought. Nothing leaps to mind about weird resistance, but I would say in working with I did work with like a Fortune 500 company, and I worked with their employee resource group. So that was an interesting experience. So they brought me in to help them brainstorm about ideas, and then they would do the work of translating that into their own environment. So we put together like a bunch of, we looked at, human resources. We did the sorts of things that the students did in their presentations earlier today, which is just do this gender audit where we looked at all the policies that they had in place. So what are your health insurance, dental insurance? They had a gym. What do the locker rooms look like? And I offered them a couple of different options, sort of like the reformist approach versus a more radical approach, and so that's sort of how I work with that company. Yeah, but weird resistance. I don't know. Isn't all resistance weird on some level? Maybe. I don't know.
Okay, so just asking because you're a trans, right? Like, correct? Is that correct?
Trans, yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
Just asking from like your personal experience, what was the most, like, I guess, how did you feel the most discriminated or just not a part of society? Like, what was the most thing that made you feel that way, in a sense?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that, and I should also say, I mean, I feel like I've gone through most of the letters in the LGBTQ. So I've had that experience also of identifying as lesbian and bisexual and queer. But when it comes to being trans, I would say that the most difficult thing was the sort of the administrative process of getting my sex markers changed on driver's license, passport, things like that, Social Security. So you have no idea about kind of like what this whole the administration of gender looks like until you have to actually go through it. And the thing that's was really problematic and discriminatory and oppressive was that each place had a different set of rules, and so it wasn't consistent across the board. Also, and this going back to 2008 now, so things are somewhat different. A lot of this I had to actually like go down to the DMV and have that conversation or fill out that paperwork. And I was okay. I mean, I did it, but I never want anybody to have to go through that again. I think it's a really shitty thing, to pardon my French or whatever, but it's like to force somebody to have to go and make those phone calls, go to those offices and say like, here's my situation, to go through that is a lot to ask of people, and particularly young people. And so that's a lot of the motivation for my work, is to get the policies changed so that people can make these changes if they want a lot easier. You should be able to do a lot of this just sitting in front of your computer or on your phone. And that's what we're trying to do. Like at Temple, we're having some of these conversations about letting students choose their preferred name that they want their professors to use. Let them do it online so they don't have to have an awkward conversation. And I'm basically, despite the fact that I'm standing up here, basically an introvert. So it was even worse, to have to kind of go and do that. So,
So I was wondering what you think about, I've heard about arguments about having particularly young people be able to choose their identity, and like this problems that could be. And so I was just kind of wondering what you have to say about that.
Yeah. So that's, I think, a big question. I think there's maybe two levels and how I would answer it. One is sort of just like how I feel about it based on the knowledge that I have about it. But also, and somebody made this point to me recently, that where we are with that issue, and this is the issue about, providing hormone blockers to trans youth so that they can delay the onset of changes that happen at puberty. And have people seen the show I Am Jazz? Show of hands of people who've seen it. Yeah. So okay. So you, those of you who've seen the show, know that was Jazz's experience. So this is the fact that we are focusing now, or I feel like a lot of like conservative arguments hostile to trans civil rights are focusing on this issue, much in the same way that they did about sort of like the gay and lesbian movement and its relationship to children, and this idea that if you had a gay teacher in a school, they were going to turn your kid gay. That they're harming innocent children, and so I think that there's that narrative that we have to be cognizant about, like how are those critiques being used, and who's saying them to what end. But it is true that we don't at this point know some of like the longer term health consequences for youth. It's also true that we don't know necessarily the long term consequences of hormone replacement therapy that adults choose to undergo. However, I think that for a lot of us, the risks were worth it in a sense to live our authentic lives. And in a lot of cases, and Jazz talks about this, especially for trans youth, that it could be a matter of life and death for them. And so seeing young people really struggle to be recognized, I think, is something that, like, I think we let parents make a whole bunch of other decisions, for their kids. I'm a parent right now too, so I'm experiencing that. And I think that this falls into that category as well. And I don't know of any cases where this was done in sort of like a reckless way. You can't just like walk in and, as a kid and say, I want to be on, hormone suppression, just like you can't do that as an adult to get hormone replacement therapy. So it's a considered process. And I think a lot of the studies show that from a pretty young age, kids are telling us who they are in terms of their gender. And so I feel like that's, but it is a good question.
Throughout the United States, where do you think it is easiest to live, like, as a member of the LGBTQ community, what area do you experience, like, the highest acceptance rates and kind of least discrimination, where it's just kind of easier to make that transition?
I mean, so different organizations have all sorts of maps about that, you know, and I guess surveys about the best places to live. And I mean, but it's complicated. And I started out by talking about the fact that I appreciate being here in Nebraska, and it's like really, really heartening to see people who've like born here, raised here, staying here, and you know, and talking about sort of what that looks like. So I don't. And the other thing that's complicating too is that you know, like I also grew up as a biracial, half black, half white kid in a white farming community. So that was an experience. And I think, so race is also a factor there. So there can be certain places that are very, maybe good places to live as a white gay man, but they might not be the best places for an African-American transgender woman or something like that. So I think like just when we talk about the community, I always sort of encourage my students just to be very specific. Like, are you really talking about all of the letters or just some of them? And I feel like we should be specific about that. So it might differ as my answer depending on the letter that you land on.
When you were talking about making it easier, not having those awkward conversations about having to do like say what your preferred name was online, I wanted to share a really great experience that I've had here at UNK with a certain design professor. When you start the class with him, he puts out a getting to know you survey, and he is one of the only professors that I've seen that he asks for your preferred pronouns. And this was before I even got involved in the LGBT community in Kearney. So I would just like to applaud Samuel Rapine in the art department, because if you have him, you'll be fine. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And it's also helpful just, I think as instructors, a lot of us are often struggling, like how do we ask students about their pronouns without singling people out, and how do you do that? So that is this an online form? So that's interesting. I like that too, because again, then you can just do it in the privacy of your home. Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad you had that.
Just piggybacking off of the where is easiest to live, a class analysis is necessary, because San Francisco might be really nice if you can afford it. You can't most of the time.
Yeah. That's a hugely important point just about class, and it can drop out of our analysis too often. And it's I'm glad that you brought that up. Yeah, no one can afford to live in San Francisco.
No one can park in San Francisco either. This might be a little bit of a personal question, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. When you were like in the process of coming out, along with like when you were first getting into your studies, for what you wanted to do, was there ever a moment where you were like, oh God, I'm going to have to talk about this for the rest of my life? This is me now. This is just what I'm going to...
Yeah.
Basically.
Well, thank you for that question. It's really thoughtful. I appreciate it. And I said before, I mean, I'm basically like an introvert. A lot of people go into academia because we're like into books and reading, and we're nerds and spend a lot of time alone. And then we're thrust into this environment where like, oh, stand in front of like 200 people and give a lecture. And it seems like a really cruel joke, or at least misleading advertising. So yeah, but I gave a lot of thought to sort of, especially, do I want to write about this, you know? And I had to wait a number of years after I transitioned to actually write the book, because it would have been too close to what I was going through. But once I felt like I was on stable ground, I thought about, you know, the benefit, how I would have loved to have read a book, you know, like the one that I would write. And so I did it. And I do this work and go to talk to people not because it's super easy for me to do, but I think it's like very important. And we had a conversation earlier about what we can do as professors and people with, you know, a certain amount of power and even having tenure, and now I have an administrative position, to really try to, you know, realize that with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility, and I can say and do things that other people can't do without losing their job. And I think I take that seriously, and it's really important for me to do what I can. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, looking back, I guess, if there was one thing that you could tell your previous self, I guess, what would it be? Like, before really diving into your transition, like, what would be one piece of advice that you would give yourself?
That's a good question. Does anybody watch RuPaul's Drag Race? Okay, that's my favorite show, where like just entertainment and good vibes in a very troubling political world right now. But that's a question that RuPaul often asks towards the end of the season about like, and it elicits. So it's like a great question about like, what could you tell your, you know, as a kid? What would you say? And I think, I mean, a lot of them say that, you know, that hang in there, that things will get better. And I think that that's probably what I would say as well. But in addition to that like you'll get to a place where you do have a little bit of power and you can make some changes happen. And that's really important. And I go back to this amazing student panel that previous to this, because I think it's important. All of you are parts of organizations, places where you work, clubs, things that you do for hobbies. And you have a lot of power to be able to go and question, not in a confrontational way. Nobody responds well to being threatened with a lawsuit, so don't start off there. But just to say like, hey, I noticed that we have this policy that mentions gender, whatever, with like a dress code or something. Like, why don't we consider changing that? Or like, could we do that? Like, what's the goal here? Like, to have those conversations. So I think I'm in a position where I can go and talk to a lot of different people and have those conversations, which is something I couldn't foresee when I was little, and it is an empowering thing. So again, for all of you, that's the best thing that you could do as an ally, is to go out and to ask those questions on behalf of people who are trans and gender, non-binary.
What are your thoughts on
Where's the voice
I'm loud.
coming from?
Sex classification and organized athletics? And if we were to ungender organized athletics, how would we provide girls and women equal opportunity?
Yeah. So that is the last case study in my book, because it's the hardest one that I consider, and hardest to the extent that it raises people's, it's one of the places, also prisons, where people are just like, wait, whoa, slow down, wait a second, we can't do that. In sports, we have to look at what we're using sex segregation as a proxy for, and often it's information about strength and endurance in sports where that matters. In sports where it doesn't matter, you have like sex segregation can fall to the wayside. And there's the case of Caster Semenya that people might know of, who's a track star, and has an intersex condition called hyperandrogenism. And we haven't really talked about intersex, and that's an important part of this conversation as well, because there aren't just two biological sexes. There are people, it's a spectrum, and there are a number of different intersex conditions or experiences. So she's on that spectrum. So now the IAAF and the Olympic Committee has moved to functional testosterone as the thing that they want to focus on. So if you are a trans woman and want to compete in female sports at the elite level, you have to have did I get that right? Trans woman wanting to compete as female, you have to have your testosterone has to be under a certain level, and they've just sort of reduced that even further. And so testosterone, is sex a good proxy for the amount of testosterone that you have in your system? there's a lot of variance there. Also, I just read on the plane coming out here, Martina Navratilova, which I was a little disappointed that she had written this op-ed where she made this argument that trans women should never ever be allowed to play in competitive female athletics. And she brought up this horrible stereotype that, like, you know, well, what about that guy, that man who's going to just like go and do this so he can get a competitive advantage and like enter women's professional tennis and or whatever and win everything, and like that just doesn't make any sense, like on so many different levels. So that was sort of disappointing to read that, but I think that that's where a lot of people are still with it. That instead of like saying, okay, maybe this is about functional testosterone, if we really want to divide things up in that way, about strength and endurance, not necessarily about like the sex that you were assigned at birth. Yeah. So it's a tough one because it's also not just your strength or endurance or your testosterone level. It has to do with like the opportunities that you had growing up to train and like the what you do to cultivate your gift for a particular sport. I mean, there's so many different variables that go into it. Yeah. Complicated question.
Read the book. There's a whole chapter.
I get the last word.
Okay.
If you were going to make policy changes for a university such as Temple or University of Nebraska Kearney, what are the big sex discriminatory factors you would tackle first, and how would you do so?
Yeah, I would go to the bathroom. I would go to the bathroom issue is really, really important, and it's a problem that can be solved architecturally. You just have to have, as an organization, the motivation for doing it. You can retrofit existing sex-segregated bathrooms. There are some colleges that have transformed. They have like sex-neutral bathrooms that they've transformed on one floor, and then the next floor is sex-segregated, and they go like that. So they give people the option. That's important. It's problematic. I know that the fight is for just to get one gender-neutral bathroom in like a building, and that's important to have. But it's not enough. You have to do more than that, and I think that we can do more than that. It's a struggle at my own university. I think a lot of colleges are waiting to see what other peer institutions do. I would say for the students here, the administration, board of trustees will listen to you if your voices are loud enough. And just understanding more now that I'm an administrator how these places work. That's true. I can, they'll listen to us to a certain extent, but you are the ones that are paying tuition, and they're the ones, that they want to keep happy. So I feel like once that swell of activism really comes from the students, then you're going to see changes. The changes themselves are super simple, very, very simple to do. There's just not the motivation to do it. But if students really get their voices out there collectively, that there will be a response.
Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Heath Fogg Davis